Another big story this week, Bitcoin broke through 2,000. That will be our special bottom line segment. So Bitcoin now more than 2,000 would have been inconceivable 5 years ago. In fact, if you had even suggested this, you would have been laughed out town, called reckless and irresponsible and all of those things that folks are called when they look into the future and take any asset and say, oh, it could someday be trading at many multiples of today's price. But what do we know about Bitcoin? So I would say there are 3 points that I would leave you with. And I got to know Bitcoin first about 4 or 5 years ago. I'll tell you that story in a second. But first thing with Bitcoin is this is the perfect asset for a speculative bubble. Why? First, there is no intrinsic value to Bitcoin. And I don't care what arguments people make about how there is intrinsic value and how Bitcoin should be valued as some percentage of global GDP or some relative number to gold. Anybody who's telling you that, put down the Kool-Aid, back away. There is no intrinsic value here whatsoever. The only value is what somebody else is willing to pay for it. And fortunately for those who hold pots of Bitcoin these days, folks seem to be willing to pay a little bit more for it, and ultimately we've driven the prices way up. Second thing about Bitcoin is there is, theoretically at least, infinite upside. Most stocks are usually ultimately tied to cash flow. Apple, most profitable company out there, its stock trades in relation to the amount of cash it generates. Bitcoin doesn't have that problem. If folks decide that Bitcoin should be worth a gazillion dollars a coin, ultimately it can be. There's nothing holding it back. So it is a perfect asset for a speculative bubble. And then the other thing people say is, oh, but those Bitcoin investors, they're nuts. It's crazy. They could lose everything. They could lose everything. There's no question. It could go to zero easily, very quickly. But the math, if you are a Bitcoin speculator, works something like this. The most you can lose is everything, 100%. But the most you can gain, 10x, 100x, 1,000x, all very conceivable. And so when folks who can afford to be diversified and understand it look at that, they say, you know what? I'm going to take those odds. There's so much upside. Maybe I'll lose everything, but wow, if I'm right, I'm right. And that has helped drive the price up. My Bitcoin story, I heard about Bitcoin for the first time about 4 or 5 years ago when I was sitting around a dinner table with a bunch of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, and they said, Henry, next big thing, Bitcoin. And they were right there with the smartphone and the wallet, and they said, you got to see this. Here it is. It's Bitcoin. And they showed me at the table. They had about $100,000 worth of Bitcoin on somebody's smartphone at that point. And I watched them basically pass it around the table to each other. It's just a crazy sort of value, and it's such an amazing technology, and it can be worth so much. At that dinner, Bitcoin was worth 30. Everybody thought that was insane because it was up from 10 a year or two earlier. Everybody got rich, couldn't go any higher. By the time I got back to New York and Business Insider to write about this, Bitcoin was already 90, began to write about that, wrote a piece called Bitcoin Could Go to $1 million or zero, was treated with the usual comments that one gets when one writes a story like that, but explained the logic. Bitcoin was 340 then, it went to 1,200, then it went back to 200, maybe even 190, and now here we are at 2,200. So we are along for the ride. But my belief is that the key for Bitcoin going forward, if it's going to continue to appreciate, is usage. As long as folks are actually transacting in Bitcoin, that is a good sign that the use of Bitcoin and the adoption of Bitcoin is likely to spread. So I think actually this is the most important chart for Bitcoin, which is the transactions per day globally. And what you see is that it continues to increase. It's not steady, quite volatile, but the trend is up. And that very much is a vote of confidence for the fact that people will want Bitcoin and use it going forward. And if that is the case, then the price can continue to go up. And in fact, somebody much smarter than I am, Jeremy Liu, who's a partner at Lightspeed Ventures, which invested in Snapchat and others, very strong, smart venture capitalist, that makes a very compelling and precise case that Bitcoin should be worth 500,000 or more in 15 years per coin. And the way he looks at it is that ultimately let's ascribe a value to every person who ultimately uses Bitcoins and transact in Bitcoin. That, in other words, that you will keep some around, you'll just have it, and so that will control the trading supply of it. And he estimates that 25,000 per user Ultimately, that gets you to $500,000 a coin, given that there should be a finite supply of them. So a specific way of saying, hey, Bitcoin can go a lot higher. So what's the bottom line? My bottom line is Bitcoin could be ultimately worth $1 million or more, or zero, or anywhere in between. We just don't know. It is the perfect asset class for a speculative bubble, and we may be in the middle of one of those. But it is also a useful new tool, and the usage is increasing, and as if the usage continues to increase, ultimately that is a good sign for prices.